So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. Today's session is a joint presentation by the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Moncton, the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, and the St. John Region Chamber of Commerce. Our three chambers have worked very closely during the COVID-19 pandemic to communicate and to advocate on behalf of our members. My name is John Wishart, and I am CEO of the Greater Moncton Chamber. Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette rencontre virtuelle présentée par la Chambre de commerce pour le Grand Moncton, la Chambre de Fredericton et la Chambre régionale de Saint-Jean. Mon nom est John Wishart, je suis le PDG de la Chambre de Grand Moncton. Today we're very pleased to present a session by the Group M5 and MQO Research. M5 is the largest integrated marketing communications group in Atlantic Canada, and MQO is their research division within that group. So MQO conducted an online survey of close to 800 Atlantic Canadians from May 9th to 13th to gauge their travel intentions, their purchasing intentions, and their overall economic confidence. And I think their data will help prepare all of us on the call today for what's ahead for the remainder of 2020 and beyond. It's my pleasure to introduce today's two guest speakers. So following a long and successful career in provincial politics, Victor Boudreau joined M5, where he is now the Vice President of Business Development. And joining Victor today is Leanne Sarson, who is the Vice President of Research and Engagement for MQO Research. So welcome both to Victor and Leanne. So after their presentations, we'll have some time left for a Q&A. Today's Q&A will be moderated by my colleague and friend from the Fredericton Chamber, Krista Ross. And at the end of the session, David Duplessis, who's the CEO of the St. John Region Chamber, will have some concluding words. I should note that everyone's microphones have been muted for the webinar, but you can pose a question at any time during the presentation by using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So, without further ado, Victor, I believe you're going to lead off and then pass the baton to Leanne, so take it away.
Well, thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Bon matin tout le monde. First off, I do want to thank John and David and Krista and the three chambers of the Greater Moncton region, the St. John region, and the Fredericton region for hosting Leanne and myself this morning. Also want to welcome all the members of the three chambers that are participating, the entrepreneurs that are out there. Nous voulons vous partager quelques données que nous avons pu rassembler il y a quelques semaines, des données très pertinentes autour de la pandémie du COVID-19. We hope that what we're going to share with you this morning is going to help you make some informed decisions, possibly as small and medium-sized businesses moving forward. So we are going to talk about an online survey that was conducted May 9th to the 13th by 800 people across Atlantic Canada. And at a time when most provinces, actually with the exception of Nova Scotia, had started easing restrictions. So people were starting to move around a little more freely. Businesses were starting to open up. So it's pretty pertinent information that we hope is going to be able to assist you. So I just wanted to start very briefly before handing it over to Leanne to just talk briefly about M5, the group of companies, and who we are and what we do. So we are, as the name suggests, a group of companies. MQO Research is a very important part of that group, and they are a quantitative, qualitative market research type of agency. We have offices in all four Atlantic provinces with focus group facilities available in all four provinces as well. And it's all about being, trying to be Atlantic Canada's leading market research company. And MQO Research, as I mentioned, is part of Group M5, which also includes four other companies. So we do have M5 Public Affairs, which will focus on things like government relations, public affairs, stakeholder engagement, crisis communications, those types of services, again, across all four provinces. Wavelight Productions is our in-house audio, video production company. So we have our own in-house company, and they are going to do things like TV and radio commercials, corporate videos, training videos, animation, digital productions, all kinds of things for the variety of our clients across the region. We have Groupe ATN, which is an important, fairly new member of the Group M5 companies. And Groupe ATN is a specialized consultancy that work with both private and public sector companies. Clients. They also do a lot of work with First Nations and work on Aboriginal projects, NGOs, and they'll do things like economic impact studies, feasibility studies for the variety of clients. And last but not least is M5 Marketing Communications, which I refer to as our flagship company. M5 Marketing Communications has approximately 120 employees across Atlantic Canada, and we are the largest fully integrated marketing agency in the region. And I'll ask Leanne maybe just to move to the next slide. Again, our locations across Atlantic Canada. Most recently, we acquired Revolution Strategy that was in St. John, New Brunswick. So we now have 2 offices in New Brunswick, one in Moncton, where I'm located, and one in St. John, as well as offices in St. John's, Newfoundland, Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, where Leanne is located. So we are Atlantic Canadian owned and operated, and serve clients of all shapes and sizes from across the region. Next slide, please, Leanne. Just to touch finally on M5 Marketing Communications, as I mentioned, a fully integrated one-stop shop for all marketing and communications needs. So these are some of the examples of the various services we offer. So I do want to move on, because I know you're primarily interested in the data that we have to share with us, we have to share with you today. So I'm going to ask Leanne to move to the next slide and to take over. And as John said earlier, Leanne Sarson is our VP Research and Engagement with MQO Research, and she works out of our Halifax office. So Leanne, over to you, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to start by just getting a little bit of context for the goal of the session today. As Victor noticed, we do a lot of things at M5, but one thing he didn't mention was producing vaccines or personal protective equipment. So as we were looking around for ways that we could help and contribute, we thought one thing that we could do is support businesses by providing information that would hopefully help them with planning the way ahead as we decide how we're going to operate alongside the coronavirus, which unfortunately is going to probably be with us for a while. And so the intention of this session is to share some insights on the current consumer mindset and provide some of that context for planning right now, because there has been a drastic change, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, between what we saw in March and what we're seeing now as things slowly start to open up. And there we go. So now that the initial shocks of the pandemic are past and we have this tenuous handle on the situation, restrictions are starting to ease, it's really an opportunity for everyone to slow down for a minute and take a look at your position, competition, customers, how they've changed, so that you have an opportunity to plan ahead. I've heard a lot of folks that I've talked to get a lot of excitement around this idea of getting back to normal. And I'm hesitant by that, because the economy, although it's reopening, there really isn't an opportunity to get back to normal. In reality, normal is not going to be an option. It's not going to cut it in the post-pandemic environment. Businesses are having to figure out how to operate under new restrictions. They are faced with more potential closures as future outbreaks, like the small outbreak that you're currently dealing with, battling in Campbellton, force loosening restrictions to be dialed back. Consumer behavior and attitudes have changed. There's a report that was put out by Reach 3 Insights that found that 76% of consumers have picked up new habits, behaviors, and routines, and a lot of those are going to stick. 36% of consumers are trying new brands. Some of that's due to brands that they would normally have access to not being available as easily online. So businesses are in very different positions now, as you know, than they were before COVID-19. And in some cases, this is really presenting opportunities, but it's also presenting a lot of challenges. So as the economy opens up, ad hoc responses are not going to cut it. Businesses have to lay the groundwork for recovery and operating in this post-pandemic environment. And a good place to start when planning is understanding where you are now. So that's what I'm hoping today will provide, and that everyone will be able to leave with a little better understanding on where New Brunswickers are and where Atlantic Canadians are at this moment. So I know we talked a little bit about this survey and what we did with it. It was an online survey that was conducted with just under 800 respondents in Atlantic Canada. 200 of those respondents were located in New Brunswick, so that's the group that I'm talking about when I highlight New Brunswick data. You can see the age breakdown there mirrors the Atlantic Canadian age demographic breakdown, and there's a good spread of household income as well. So as it was mentioned, the survey was conducted between May 9th and the 13th. So it's very recent, and it also took place in the context of having a sense of what the economies were going to be doing moving forward. In some cases, economies had started to open. So a little bit on where folks were at the time of the survey. Of those who were employed, 51% hadn't had to work from home. 43% were still working from home, and 6% had been working from home, but at that point had returned to the workplace. So this was a little different in New Brunswick, where New Brunswick opened fairly early. The number of individuals who had returned to work in New Brunswick was actually quite a bit higher at 8%, with only 39% of New Brunswickers currently working from home at the time of the survey. So 74% of Atlantic Canadians that were surveyed has seen a reduction in their hours and or income due to COVID-19. And in New Brunswick, about half of New Brunswickers were worried about or are worried about job security over the next 12 months. And I also have in there just an interesting side note that more women reported being laid off as a result of COVID-19 compared to men. And a lot of that is likely due to job loss in the service industry. So there were two main areas that we wanted to take a look at today and that we really kind of drilled down into, and those were travel and as well as consumer behavior and spending behavior. So 47% of Atlantic Canadians had plans for major travel, and 93% of them had canceled or postponed that travel. So 93% of them had postponed or canceled the travel, which is probably not surprising. So one thing we wanted to know is where are those travel plans going? So what are Atlantic Canadians doing if they're not able to travel, if they cancel that extent of travel plans? So we first asked whether or not people were likely to take an overnight trip in their province. As you can see, 49% of New Brunswickers said they were likely to take an overnight trip. So staycations have essentially replaced travel plans for many New Brunswickers. So 45% of the staycations will replace previously planned travel, so spending that would have taken place out of province. However, the average spend on staycations in New Brunswick people intend to spend much less than they would have spent on travel plans that they had postponed or canceled. So you can see there the average spend that people anticipate on New Brunswick travel is $316, whereas the intended spend on canceled travel plans was between $700 and about $5,000, which that ranged from Atlantic Canadian trips to out-of-country trips. People are very comfortable spending up to $2,000 or more per person for a trip down south or for a European destination. People tend to spend differently and think differently about travel that's close to home, and often will reallocate to home renovation as seeing that as a better use of money. So if you look at what RBC has been reporting for household construction, as of May, household construction spending was actually back up to pre-COVID levels. And part of this can be attributed to people reallocating what had been previously travel plans to home renovations. So this graph here just illustrates what people's intentions were in spending for in province and out of province. And you can see the drastic difference there in what people are willing to spend. So people are going on vacation at home, but the focus really needs to be on how to get them to view in-province travel differently and closer to how they would view what they would spend typically on travel that would be out of province. So one of the other things we wanted to know was whether or not people are likely to take another trip in Atlantic Canada. So we're in a fortunate position here where we are likely going to be able to open up tourism within, in particular, the maritime provinces, but hopefully Atlantic Canada as well. And so we wanted to see not only if people were willing and comfortable to go to other provinces, but whether or not they were likely to do that. And so you can see there of Prince Edward Islanders, 59% of Islanders are intending on taking a vacation within the Atlantic provinces, 36% of Nova Scotians, and 28% of Newfoundlanders. So it's likely that the New Brunswickers are going to see an increase in tourism from other Atlantic Canadian provinces. So as I said, 40% of respondents indicated they're likely to go to another Atlantic Canadian province in 2020, but we're not going to see, or very unlikely to see, much travel from outside of the country. And as far as folks leaving, that travel has dropped from the likelihood of about 14% indicating that they are likely to travel to US if they have the opportunity, and only 13% are willing to travel to countries outside Canada. So something that's important in this is it's very likely that the bulk of, if not all, of the peak 2020 tourism season and the tourism market for New Brunswick is going to be restricted to Atlantic Canada. So again, in one sense, we're fortunate. We've had fairly low cases in Atlantic Canada. And so we very likely are going to be able to open up to our neighbors. But in the maritime provinces in particular, we're going to be competing for those tourism dollars. So one thing we wanted to know was how New Brunswick residents felt about opening up their communities. And overall, New Brunswick residents feel very comfortable welcoming visitors from Atlantic Canada, but less so from other provinces, from Western and Central Canada, and even less so from outside of Canada. So this graph here illustrates the level of comfort that New Brunswickers feel in welcoming visitors to their community from different locations. And that's important for tourism as things do start to open up. If we have the opportunity to invite visitors in from Central and Western Canada, how will they be treated? So I want to move on to a little bit on spending in the economy, or economic confidence in general. As is probably not surprising, overall, Atlantic Canadians are spending less across all categories, with the exception of food and household supplies. So this has rebounded. I mentioned there was a stark drop in March. Obviously, things just stopped. And so RBC reported a 37% reduction in spending. That's actually rebounded up to about 13% reduction in spending in April from last year. So things are going back up, but they look a little differently in how people are spending. So we asked people whether or not they were spending more or less on the following day-to-day expenses. And what we found, as I said, is people have reported spending less across all categories, except for groceries and household supplies. People aren't just changing how much they spend, but on what they spend it on. So these spending patterns are really a measure of how some of these things might shift as they open back up. So for example, clothing in countries that have gotten a little farther in their reopening have seen clothing sales go back up. No one's getting out of sweats while they're working from home. But as they have to go back into the world, that's going to change. But certain things like entertainment may stay down, but what happens within that category, we're seeing shifts. So right now, out-of-home entertainment is essentially not an option for people. And people are reporting less spending in entertainment, and that could be why. However, as things open up, people are projecting that we're not likely going to see a full recovery for entertainment, but that what's happening in spending will shift there. So even though entertainment purchases across the board are lower, people have actually seen a spike in at-home or in-home entertainment. So things like video games, purchases of books have gone up, those types of things. So as things reopen and people are able to go to theaters, for example, and as small events are allowed to happen, that spending will shift from in-home entertainment to out-of-home entertainment, but the overall spending in entertainment is likely to stay the same. So I just wanted to put this up, and this is more since the slides are going to be available so you can take a look after. For interest sake, the chart overall represents the reporting from Atlantic Canada on the whole. In the brackets there, you see what the spending differences were reported for New Brunswick. So mostly the pattern is similar. There's a couple small differences there, but for the most part, New Brunswick is pretty much matching overall for Atlantic Canada for spending patterns. The other thing we looked into was major purchases. So obviously COVID-19 has had a significant impact on major purchases. 74% of Atlantic Canadians who had planned a major purchase had postponed or canceled that. So we looked specifically at new home purchases, renovation, and new vehicles. And you'll see, although people are concerned, people aren't ready to cancel just yet. The majority of people that have made changes to their planned purchases have just postponed. People are adopting a wait and see approach. It's still fairly early, and so as a result, people are still looking. There's actually increases in traffic in car sites and things, so although those purchases aren't coming back, people haven't taken that off the table. And again, I wanted to take a look specifically at New Brunswick, and you can see there for home purchases in particular, compared to other Atlantic Canadian provinces, 44% of people who are planning on purchasing a home say that the pandemic hasn't had any impact on their plans to purchase. So overall, these spending patterns do reflect concerns that people have been reporting about job security and the economy in general in coming years. And if you look at 56% of New Brunswickers feel that it will take years for the economy to recover. On the two extremes, only 5% are being optimistic and expect to bounce back in the next few months, and 10% have an extremely bleak outlook and don't think the economy will ever recover. Fears about the economy, a second wave of COVID-19 becoming affected, and access to healthcare are concerns for most New Brunswickers. The concerns are actually a little lower in New Brunswick than what we saw reported in Atlantic-wide, but they're still very, very high. The vast majority of the population has close to equal concerns around health and long-term economic impact. Another interesting point that we found is we were curious about vaccines, because obviously this is a very fluid situation. Things are changing constantly with each new press conference that comes out, each new restriction that's lifted. And the announcement of a vaccine, when that comes, if that comes, will change things significantly. So we were curious about what percentage of Atlantic Canadians would plan to get vaccinated. We actually found that 24% either don't intend to get vaccinated or aren't sure. We also looked at public support for how New Brunswick has handled the public health response. And people are incredibly supportive of the availability of health information, the restrictions that have been taken to reduce the spread. So although New Brunswickers are concerned about the economy, this support is another major indicator that the majority of the province has public health concerns and is taking this very seriously, and would likely support the rolling restrictions as new outbreaks pop up. So that was a really high-level overview of where things are, but there's a lot of things we can glean from just those few key markers. So I wanted to go over a couple of key takeaways. And again, obviously the fact that 93% of planned travel has been canceled is an enormous impact, especially as we're on the cusp of the peak of tourism season. Some of that spending will be reallocated to travel within New Brunswick, but again, the maritime provinces are going to be competing for local travel. In many cases, plans for major purchases, again, have not been canceled, but are just being put off. And so people are still looking, and they're still wanting to see advertisements and communications from companies on those major purchases. Spending's down across many categories, but it's up for groceries and household supplies. Again, that's reflective of health concerns and folks still being concerned about the economy. But as I mentioned, trends within spending do suggest that there are opportunities. So where an overall category may be down, we have seen spikes due to changes in consumer behavior in particular products. And so, and I'm going to talk a little more about the opportunities that some of this has presented for us, but the economy is opening up. It is important to recognize that there still is an enormous amount of fear and uncertainty. I do hundreds and hundreds of polls on different public opinion topics per year, and I rarely see responses that are as unanimous. You don't often see that percentage of the population that are in agreement on something. So the level of fear and the level of concern for both health and the economy is unprecedented in what I've seen in terms of folks responding to a particular issue. But again, one thing that I want to make sure that I leave you with, if nothing else, is although these changes are taking place and although some things seem dire, consumer behavior has changed, it's really important to recognize that, one, it may not return to pre-COVID state, and it's very unlikely to return to pre-COVID state, but there are opportunities. So again, this has been a very high-level overview about what's happening on mindset and intention, but there is research out there that, again, does shed some light on what opportunities might be there and what businesses have to think about to be able to take advantage of those opportunities and plan for the future. So, for example, online consumers, their older consumers are going online in record numbers. People are buying things online that they would not have previously purchased or thought about considering for online shopping. One story that I found interesting was a lot of auto companies in the auto industry are actually implementing social media and online communication training for staff, and are essentially allowing sales folks to adopt skills that will turn them into entertainers in part, because a lot of the communication and transactions are now online. So they're picking up skills to be able to adapt to these changing consumer behaviors. A lot of the trends that they're predicting around large corporations that make high-tech products, cutting-edge drugs, or provide standardized services, those are going to be tolerated, but trust and loyalty is going to be much more difficult for those and for foreign brands to be able to muster. And in many cases, post the pandemic, they're going to be second choice brands, and there's going to be an even farther push, or it's expected there will be an even farther push towards supporting local enterprises, whether it's local farms, local restaurants, neighborhood manufacturers. They're going beyond popular to become more mainstream as we come out of this. A lot of the predictions essentially picture the post-COVID world as much larger than pre-COVID and much more insular. So in terms of what that means or what you can do with that, re-examining your current marketing strategy is extremely important with the changes that are taking place in how people shop, what's important to them, what they're shopping for. Taking a look at where you're getting to people and what you're saying is vital. Making sure you're not missing out on opportunities is also key. So some basic things that I know companies that I've spoken to have missed is making sure that your information is up to date on all channels. This is how people are looking for things now. They're not speaking with friends and family face-to-face as much. They've changed the way they look for things. The other thing is looking for ways to improve stopgap measures. So in March, when things sort of fell off the cliff, everyone had to scramble to adjust to try and figure out how to operate. And a lot of the things were put in place were stopgap measures. And it's really time to take a look at which of those are going to need to be put in place permanently to not just survive post-COVID, but to be able to take advantage of some of those opportunities and improve them. The other thing is it's important to track results. A lot of businesses are in a survival mode now, and as a result, folks are trying different things, throwing them at the wall. To see what works, though, you need to be able to track how effective they are. So make sure that you're taking time to look at what is working and what's not working as you try new strategies and as you adjust to the new ways in which your customers are communicating with you, finding you, and purchasing from you. And consider a shifting focus from promoting premium products now to more everyday items for the short term. That doesn't mean to let go of marketing luxury brands or continuing on that level of marketing, but just a shift for the immediate future. It's also important to recognize that people are still fearful, and acknowledging and respecting that fear and offering comfort and reassurance is extremely important in the communications that you're putting out. Research has shown that people want to hear from companies right now. They find it reassuring to hear from their brands, but you need to acknowledge the fact that there is a high level of fear, and as a result, you have to make sure that you're communicating your plans to meet public health requirements. Make sure that they're easy for people to find. If people are making selections about where to go as things reopen, it's important that they can easily find out how you're adhering to public health measures and what steps you're taking. The other thing that I wanted to throw in was my background's in psychology, and I was recently listening to a talk on resiliency, and essentially this is research that goes into figuring out how different or what's different about people who get up versus give up when they've been struck with a trauma or a challenging event. And although it was applied to healthcare, I thought it was really relevant for businesses because essentially there's not a big difference in people that are able to get back up after hitting a setback. The only difference is how they frame the problem. And so I wanted to share this quote with you, which I find really relevant for today, which is sometimes storms don't come to disrupt your life. Sometimes they come to clear a path. And I think framing the current situation that we're in as an opportunity is extremely important in being able to come out on the other side. So you're likely, as I mentioned, in a very different position now than before COVID-19. This is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to take some time to really understand what that means. The competitive landscape has changed. There are companies that have already not been able to weather the storm, and that changes what things are going to look like. I've already spoken about the impact that businesses have seen if they haven't been able to adapt quickly to some of the restrictions that are in place. Talking to your customers right now is incredibly important. Again, 36% of people are trying new brands, trying to hang on to who you have, and looking around for what opportunities there might be to snatch up new customers. This is a perfect time. If you've been thinking about rebranding or shifting focus, improving processes, again, this is an opportunity to be able to do that. So considering if you can turn this challenge into an opportunity by planning ahead beyond COVID-19, I think is extremely important to be able to get through. So I hope that gave you a little bit of perspective and insight onto where people are at, and hopefully left you with something to work with as you begin to build the foundation for your plans for the way forward past the pandemic.
All right. Thank you, Leanne. This is Krista Ross, CEO at the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be moderating questions. And so I invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we will work our way through them. I have a first question for you, Leanne. When you were talking about 40% of respondents said they would travel to another Atlantic province, only 14% to the US, and 13% outside of that. In terms of how that question was framed, did it talk about if they are open or if we are able, or how was that framed?
Yeah, we positioned it as if restrictions are lifted. So if the travel is allowed to happen, then what your intentions are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the point that you made about 56% of New Brunswickers feel that it will take years for the economy to recover. Have you seen any information, from economists as to whether or not that would reflect an accurate perspective, or what are you hearing on that end?
It's interesting. I've actually looked, before going into this, I took a look to see kind of what economists were predicting, and it is all over the place. So there are essentially three models which you see on economic recovery. There's the V, which the majority of people have said is not going to happen with this pandemic. So that would essentially be a shock like we had in March, and then an immediate recovery after restrictions are lifted. Because the pandemic is going to stretch out for potentially a year, and because of the significance of the job loss that's going to come with it, and the restrictions around businesses. So as businesses open, they're not able to open at the capacity which they are used to being able to open. So that V shape is not a possibility. And so the 5% that think that the economy is going to bounce back in the next couple months, most economists say that that's not a likelihood. That's not going to happen. More likely, I've seen more people predicting more of a U shape, which is essentially a longer period while things are still having to operate at reduced capacity, while there are still outbreaks that are going to pop up that will force closures on and off, that's going to extend it. I haven't seen a lot of predictions on specific amounts of time, but the majority of people do say a vaccine is going to be a major player in how fast the economy recovers. And then the third model is an L shape, which is essentially a prolonged impact long beyond what we would see a vaccine for into years. And that's a very few are predicting that sort of doom and gloom scenario. So most people say it's going to be more U-shaped, and we're going to have to suffer through this until the vaccine is enabled and we can get back at regular capacity.
Mm-hmm. Is this survey something that you're planning to continue and update the results and see sort of how the consumer sentiment is changing over time?
As significant shifts happen, we would like to offer it to repeat, to be able to track, because again, some of the indicators that I mentioned, there's been a stark difference between even March and where we are now. So I think likely when most of the provinces, everyone's labeling a little differently in terms of whether it's a phase or an alert level, but as most folks get to that fourth level where they're starting to open up events again, we definitely like to take a look at where people's mindsets are. And again, check back in with those people who have paused major purchases and see if any of those purchases have gone through and what their intentions are now. And some of the other things that we're looking at is, as right now events aren't happening, but what people's expectations are, comfort levels are with going back to events once we're allowed to gather in groups of 50, 100, 1,000. Mm-hmm. Are people going to be comfortable doing that if the vaccine's not available?
Mm-hmm. I have a comment that's come in from one of our guests that talks about being appreciative of the insightful results, but also bringing up the idea of immigrants and their concerns about being able to travel to their home country and that sort of thing. And a suggestion perhaps that you might want to address some immigration challenges and some immigration travel for the next iteration of the survey.
That's actually a great idea. One of our senior consultants has been devastated by the fact that she had plans to go back and visit her family in India and is not able to do that. There are so many far-reaching impacts beyond what we've talked about today that that are really going to have a long-lasting impact on the province, even beyond the economic impact. And post-secondary education is something that we've been thinking about a lot in terms of the impact of out-of-country students coming in and being able to study, and what their thoughts are on shifting to online, whether or not that's an experience that they're going to continue.
One of the questions that's come in is that there's been a lot of focus on buying local during the pandemic, and we wonder if your research suggests this trend will continue, or will people eventually not be as tuned in to the need to support local? At the same time, there's been a lot of talk about online ordering and the ease of having things shipped. So where do you think that will fall out in terms of the research you've done?
So with this, we didn't look into that specifically, but there has been research done looking at how consumer behavior changed in the 2008-2009 in the recession, following the recession. And essentially what they found is there are a small group that were most significantly impacted by that. And it's a group that's significant enough to see a dent in the economy, that were so impacted by the events of the recession that they did change their spending patterns. It created a couple movements. One of them, just off the top of my head that I'm remembering, is the FIRE movement, if you've heard of that, which was essentially being financially responsible and retiring early. That's not the acronym, but essentially there was a movement that an enormous number of millennials started saving 50% of their paychecks, living on a shoestring. It was significant enough that they labeled it. So you're going to see a small portion of people really make significant changes that are going to be lasting. And then for the majority of people, after vaccines are available, we've seen that although people predict that people are going to be they're going to save more, they're going to spend less, after a while, things do tend to bounce back. It's about how long it takes to bounce back, and it's about what the behaviors are that go along with the shopping. So I think what we've seen is certain habits that are forming will stay. And so that's why I think online shopping is going to not go away. People have found that that's an easy way to shop. And so that's going to stick around. But what you will see bounce back and not stay potentially is the significant push for local. So it will definitely improve the it will give a boost to the buy local movement, and you will see people, and a significant portion of people that will stick with that. But for the majority of the population, they will eventually revert back.
One of the things that I have heard is shopping online, but from a local perspective, has a very quick turnaround and door-to-door delivery or curbside or what have you, whereas shopping online from other areas has resulted in lengthy delays and sometimes, in many cases, non-delivery at all because of, supply chain and transportation disruption. So that probably will suggest more people will consider local as well.
If I may add, Krista, to that point as well, from a marketing perspective, that's where I think it is so important, and Leanne, I think, made the point earlier, is making sure that you're, as an entrepreneur, as a small, medium-sized business, making sure that your social media platforms are as up-to-date as possible, and as active as possible. Maybe shifting some focus towards some digital marketing. Some out-of-home marketing. We're seeing more people than ever before walking the streets, biking the trails. So I think some people need to start focusing on, how can they reach that local clientele, that local market, and promote their local products. Well, a lot of that, I think, is done by making sure that, your things like your social media channels, your website, your digital marketing presence are up to date and as sharp as possible. And I think that's something that all entrepreneurs should, look at their own operations, their own business, and see how they can improve upon that.
And I don't know if I stressed this enough, but one of the things that I mentioned was the importance of really doubling down on those changes you've made to get through the current restrictions and making sure those don't go away, but are in fact improved. So if you're a local business that has adopted curbside pickup, that has adopted online shopping, you shouldn't give that up when things open up. You should actually double down on that and improve that experience and continue that for customers.
I was surprised to see the percentage of people that said they had reduced their restaurant takeout and restaurant delivery. I feel like everybody I know is doing their best to support local and order from those restaurants. But maybe it's just that the people that are sharing it on social media. I'm not sure. I have a question here. 93% of planned travel is being canceled. Is there any particular segment that will likely see the reallocation of that money?
Well, we have seen a lot in anything to do with home improvement. So people are stuck home for the summer and they know it. And so they're building new decks and they're putting pools in and they're gardening. They're really improving their home space, and that's indoors as well. And so a lot of that spending has been reallocated to home improvements, household items, those types of things that can create a pleasant space, because this is where we're stuck. Had seen an uptake. As far as where I do think that there's an opportunity people are terrible at predicting how much they will spend. So those overnight trips where people predict or plan to spend $300, I do think there's a huge opportunity to be able to increase the amount of spend on the staycations by shifting people's perspective in how they look at the vacation they're taking within the province. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It'll just take, again, a little bit of shift in how people are thinking about the things and activities they're doing while they're partaking in their staycation. I
can't agree more, Leanne. When you said that families are planning on traveling within the province and spending $300 on a trip, that would be, I would think, almost impossible if you're having even a couple of meals or an overnight, which leads me to a question from one of our guests who says, do you have any insights on the type of travel that Atlantic Canadians may be doing within the region? Is it just day trips? Is it camping? Is it hotels? Is it, what does it look like?
Well, a lot of it, we did ask about day trips. I'll have to go look at that, but the majority were like short overnight trips. So most provinces, you can drive to a lot of the attractions from where you are. So a single overnight stay isn't unheard of, which would explain the low dollar amount if people kind of ballparking their mind what a single night stay would cost to stay over a Saturday, Sunday. I can say, although to the point on underspending or on predicting less than what you spend, we see that in many, many other areas as well when we're looking at what people spend on if they're gambling or how much time people spend watching scrolling social media. All of those things people tend to downplay. But there's definitely opportunity to grab them when they're there. And again, if we're looking at shifting perspective, try and encouraging people to spend more than an overnight in an area. So packages of a particular area where you're grouping together items and marketing those to getting together with restaurants and activities that are in the same area, kind of grouping that as a multi-day experience would be an opportunity.
Another question here. Do you have a sense of how New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada are comparing to the rest of the country with regards to these types of questions and the information you've shared with us today?
For the things like spending, overall spending, it's fairly on trend. Like you see differences more city by city as opposed to, I would say, province, because it's really dependent on where there are significant outbreaks. As you saw, the majority of the population are still very concerned about both health and economic impacts. And so I'd be hard pressed to see anywhere where you're going to see a higher level of concern than what you see in Atlantic Canada in other provinces. But it's really hard to compare province to province because the restrictions are so different in different places and they're changing so quickly, and the extent of the outbreak is different. Like Quebec's a perfect example. The difference between what you would see in Montreal and what you would see in northern Quebec is starkly different. So I would say looking at Quebec as a whole wouldn't be a good comparable. But if you look at overall spending drops, we're pretty on par.
Okay. I have a comment here from Advocate Printing, thanking you for the information and that you sparked an idea that might work for the company.
That's wonderful.
That might be beneficial for tourism operators. So good job, Tom. That's great. Come up with new ideas from the information we hear in webinars or in workshops. That's great. I wanted to mention when you talked about the spending for home repairs and home renovations and so on, I was speaking to the owner of Amazon Pools here in Fredericton, and they told me that they are fully booked for the summer for pool installation and construction, and they are at this point unable to take on any more projects. Now, of course, as more projects may be recommended to them, maybe they'll hire more people and have a bigger output. But at the current time, they're telling us that they're booked. And so people are spending. It's just, maybe readjusted from some of their travel plans or so on. I have another question here on any sense of how the hotels and motels are doing at this time. Is there some upswing in occupancy, or what's happening there at this point?
I actually don't have much information, any information on that, and haven't looked into that extensively. So locally, I'm not sure what you would see. I could wager a guess that they would be down, particularly because there would be end of year conferences and things that would be taking place. So I'd say year over year, it's almost certain that they're down. Whether or not they've seen an upswing in March, at least on March, I wouldn't expect it to be much yet. So the major purchases information that we shared that indicated that people, for the most part, are taking a wait and see approach. That's true of travel as well. Although people intend to take overnights and intend to visit other provinces in Atlantic Canada, we're still very early in the opening phases. And so for the most part, these are just plans. People haven't taken them yet, and they're still waiting for things to continue to open and for opportunities to see. And I think one of the things that has been in my mind in terms of it's not a race to open, but essentially which province is able to kind of get those tourism offerings up and going first may factor into how much of that market you're able to access, because people are keeping, again, traffic on websites is up, people are looking, people want to take those trips and want to spend. They just haven't made the decisions yet because things are still moving around so much.
We have a comment from one of our guests. It's a company by the name of Jeramand. And they said that they were concerned about the loss of business because they weren't participating this year in the home show, but that their teams are currently booked with work for the next 2 months. So, certainly there are some businesses that are being, I wouldn't say positively impacted, but perhaps they're not being negatively impacted and maybe are optimistic outlook for going forward. I have their operations, what would it be? And secondly, as Chambers of Commerce, your hosts today, what type of advocacy should we still be doing towards the government to help businesses to get through this phase of recovery? So 2 questions: key message for business for the coming year, and key message for Chambers on how we should be advocating. And after you answer that, David, the floor will be yours.
So I'm going to reverse them if that's okay and answer the advocacy question first. I'd say I would encourage innovative thinking and changes to regulations to support, again, that grab, in particular for the tourism dollars that's going to be up for the Atlantic market. There's going to be limited dollars there, and getting a jump on being the province to be able to grab some of that is going to make a difference. Initiatives like I know in Fredericton, the patio, I can't remember the actual term, but the open patio policy that has essentially waived fees for businesses to have outside patios, and has made it easier for them. Yeah, and it has made it easier for businesses to do that. Things like that, changes like that, will have a massive impact, I think, to allow businesses to adjust, which is important, and I'll talk about it again in a minute, and to be able to maximize what you can grab of that summer market, which is going to be reduced in 2020. And I'd say for the message that I'd like to definitely leave in everyone is a message of optimism. There is opportunity, optimism and planning. Those are the 2 things. So I do think that it's extremely important to look at this, to try and look at this as an opportunity. It is a terrible situation and everyone is struggling, but at the same time, I would encourage you to reframe it and to think about this as an opportunity to do the things that you've been thinking about doing and maybe put off, to look at trying some new innovative things, to change the way you talk to your customers, and definitely to plan into the future. So I think looking out in a year, the most important thing, regardless of what actions you end up taking, because they will be different business to business depending on where you were at before COVID, but I think it would be looking at it as a growth opportunity instead of a survival situation. I think that would be the biggest message is look towards growth and push towards growth, not just survival.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. And you're right. We're at that phase now where we need to get past looking at just how are we going to, keep the lights on or get the lights back on. We need to brighten the lights and shine the light on the services that we're able to provide to our clients and our members. So thanks to the Moncton and St. John Chambers for co-hosting with us, and to you folks. And David, I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Krista. And I would like to add my personal thanks to Victor and Leanne as well. I know I've known Victor for years, and it's nice to meet you, Leanne. I love the way you concluded this session with growth versus survival. That's a wonderful message to take away, because many of our members in our businesses in the community have been so focused on survival that it's been very, very difficult to see any glimmer of hope. So I love that we have framed this as a conclusion is growth versus survival. I think that the key takeaways, we've seen tremendous changes in consumer behaviors, competitive behaviors, and out of these changes in behavior comes new opportunities. From a takeaway, you've given us tremendous amount of data on where some of these funds will be reallocated, what sectors, and that provides more opportunities for growth as well. So first of all, on behalf of the St. John Chamber, thank you to Victor and to Leanne for sharing these results with us. To all of the members that are joining us from the region, thank you as well. And thank you to Krista and John as always. Krista, John, and I, we chat regularly. You know, nothing happens to one that doesn't happen to all three of us. So, and I think that's the way it has to be. So again, thank you so much. We're delighted with the work that M5 Group of Companies has done. We look forward to continuing the relationship with M5 and the Chambers of Commerce. And I think that together that we can help our members in the business community to better understand the situation and how to better grow throughout it. So again, thank you from all of us here at the Chamber Movement to all of you there at the Group 5 Group of Companies. And thank you as well to all of the members that signed on. Please stay in touch with us and we'll get through this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.